This video is part 1 of chapter 9, and in chapter 9 we're going to get into a little bit more detail regarding how cells process energy and are able to facilitate cellular functioning through this processing of energy. As we already know, living cells require lots of energy from outside sources in order to do work. Some animals get their energy by eating plants, some animals get their energy by eating other animals. We'll get into a little bit more on that later. Energy flows into an ecosystem as sunlight and then leaves as heat. If we remember the laws of thermodynamics from chapter 8, this is kind of an overall view of this. The process which creates the molecules that other organisms use for energy is photosynthesis, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Photosynthesis generates a couple of things, oxygen and organic molecules such as sugar, which are both then used in the process of cellular respiration. What cellular respiration does is it generates ATP, which powers cellular work. The processes in cellular respiration are considered catabolic because what they do is they break things down and they release energy. And the way that energy is released is through electron transfer. That has a lot to do with these pathways and how they move energy around. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and then get into some detail on cellular respiration. The breakdown of organic molecules is exergonic, and we already know what that means. And that involves two major pathways. One is called fermentation, which is the partial breakdown of sugars that occurs without any oxygen. We'll get into that in part 2 of chapter 9. Then there's aerobic respiration, which consumes organic molecules like sugars and oxygen and yields ATP. And we're going to spend more time on that as well. Cellular respiration includes both aerobic and anaerobic pathways, but it's often referred to as aerobic respiration because without oxygen, your cells use other pathways that aren't necessarily directly part of cellular respiration. What happens in cellular respiration is the breakdown of glucose, which results in the release of energy. C6H12O6 is glucose, and along with oxygen, the processes of cellular respiration take those, use them, and produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy, which is then used to put ATP together, which, as we know, is the molecule that cells use for cellular work. The basic way in which these reactions work is through what is called oxidation and reduction, what we refer to collectively as redox reactions. What redox reactions do is they transfer electrons through chemical reactions, and during that transfer, energy is released, which is ultimately going to be used to put together ATP. Oxidation, which is the ox part of redox, is where a molecule loses electrons or is oxidized. Reduction is the opposite process, and in this case, a substance or a molecule gains electrons. Notice that it seems kind of backwards to say that reduction is the gaining of electrons, but that's just the vocabulary that we use, so you need to understand that and remember that. One thing about oxidation and reduction is they always occur together. So whenever a substance is oxidized, another substance must be reduced at the same time so that stray electrons aren't floating around inside of a cell. The substance or molecule that donates the electron is called the reducing agent because it's going to send those electrons to another molecule and reduce them. The molecule that receives those electrons is referred to as the oxidizing agent. Okay. Now, not all redox reactions transfer electrons, but in some cases covalent bonds are changed and electrons are passed between molecules. Now, the oxidation and reduction of molecules can be a very, very energy expensive or release a lot of energy. Okay, these are reactions that cost a lot of energy but also release a lot of energy. So because of that, electron transfer is usually carried out via multiple reactions or through pathways so that the energy transfer along the way is smaller and not into one big explosion. Now, one of the molecules that's very important in that process is the molecule known as NAD+. It's what we call a coenzyme. What coenzymes do is they help facilitate the transfer of electrons from molecule to molecule. And this molecule is involved all throughout the various processes in cellular respiration. So when NAD is reduced, it becomes NADH. It can then becomes an oxidizing agent and can then transfer those electrons that it just picked up when it was reduced to other molecules. Okay, the processes that occur in cellular respiration, we've already talked about transfer electrons throughout the pathways. And cellular respiration basically harvests energy from glucose, and it has 3 stages. We're going to get into all 3 of these stages. The first is glycolysis, which breaks down glucose into pyruvate. That pyruvate is then processed in the citric acid cycle. The products of the citric acid cycle then go to oxidative phosphorylation, which accounts for most of the ATP synthesis in a cell. Notice that the products of one pathway become the reactants in the next. So each of these pathways fuels the next. So the product of glycolysis, which is pyruvate, makes the citric acid cycle go. The products of the citric acid cycle, which we'll talk about in a minute, then make the oxidative phosphorylation pathway go. So as we look at the different diagrams, they're all color-coded to indicate which process is which. And then here's an overall diagram that shows how these processes work. So we have glycolysis, which notice occurs in the cytoplasm or the cytosol. Its products are then sent into the mitochondrion, which is where citric acid cycle and then oxidative phosphorylation occur. And again, we're going to get into all 3 of these different pathways individually. Let's start with glycolysis. And as we mentioned earlier, what glycolysis does is it harvests chemical energy by oxidizing glucose into pyruvate. The term glycolysis literally means sugar splitting. Glyco means sugar, and lysis means splitting. And what this process does is it breaks down glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Now, the book goes into a lot of detail on each of the steps in the pathway, and we're not going to do that. We're just going to break glucose down into 2 major phases: the energy investment phase and the energy payoff phase. Okay? Now, one thing that's important to understand is glycolysis will occur whether or not oxygen is present. But it is the very first pathway in cellular respiration. And we'll get into how that all happens as we work our way through this lecture and then the next one. So let's look at the 2 basic phases of glycolysis. In the first phase, the energy investment phase, a couple of things happen. Well, one major thing happens here. 2 ATP must be invested or used to get the pathway going. Think of it like when you invest money. You have to have money to make money. So in order for glycolysis to happen, 2 ATPs are invested, and they phosphorylate glucose. That molecule then will go through the energy payoff phase, where a series of oxidation and reduction reactions occur. 4 ATP are produced, 2 NADH are produced, and then 2 pyruvate are produced. Now notice that there are 4 ATP produced along the way. However, since we invested 2 in the first place, or 2 ATP in the first place, the net production of ATP is 2. So if we look at the overall output of glycolysis, we get 2 pyruvates. Water is a byproduct of all of these processes. 2 ATP and 2 NADH. The pyruvates are going to move into the citric acid cycle. The ATP will be used for cellular work, and then the 2 NADH are actually going to go into oxidative phosphorylation.